Okay. Are you gonna be a part of it today? Let's do one of our original intros. We're back, the used to be headless YouTuber and her trusty pug Pudge, and today we are talking about all things no drainage, and it's gonna be a long one, I think. Okay, how about you go with your dad? How about that? This fungus gnat is pissing me off. Oh my gosh, I'm so hungry. So like I mentioned, we are going to be talking all things no drainage. I opened up my Instagram to questions about no drainage, anything that I wouldn't have answered in the 2 videos that I did before. So just to preface, before you watch this, I highly recommend watching at least part 2 of my no drainage video, which I actually have pinned on my YouTube homepage. So the first video that I did about no drainage is just showing you all of the plants in my collection that I had growing in no drainage at the time. And then part 2 was kind of doing more demonstrations about how to pot your plants in no drainage, how to combine and mix different mediums and why I do that, talking about root rot and fertilization and watering schedules. So that I tried to make it as sort of all encompassing as possible, but it turns out there are still some questions, which some of them are really good questions, and I'm glad that I'm doing this video. But all that to say, I highly recommend at least watching part 2 of that video, because I did get a ton of questions that were answered in that video, so I won't be addressing them today. But yeah, watch that first and then come back here and hopefully all of your questions will be answered. I have 40 questions? Maybe 39 questions. No, 40. Yeah, I've got 40 questions to go through today. The first question is, how do you use no drainage with tree fern fiber? So at the time that I filmed part 1 and 2 of the no drainage videos, I actually was not using tree fern fiber yet. I had no experience with it, but now I do have some experience under my belt with tree fern fiber, and I actually have some examples to show you. So off the bat, I'm going to tell you that it's really not any different than any other substrate that you would use in no drainage. I will say though that I don't really ever use tree fern fiber alone as a standalone substrate. I always mix it with at least perlite or with lechuzapon, and because of how expensive tree fern fiber is, I just find it better for me financially to make it stretch a lot further rather than just using it alone. I have had experience using it alone, but I much prefer it with amended substrates like pon and perlite, like I mentioned. So the 2 plants that I'm going to show you today, the first one is my red crystal port, and this one is in a mix of tree fern fiber and lechuzapon. There's like a lot of lechuzapon in here and a little bit of tree fern fiber, but I love this combination so much, and so do my plants. So Anthurium with tree fern fiber specifically has been amazing. If you watched, oh my gosh, if you watched my video that I put out, I think it was last year or 2021, no, I think it was last year, where I was like attempting to rehab a bunch of Anthurium chunks in tree fern fiber, that went horribly. I never did a follow-up video to that because they all died. I basically went to California and they all completely dried out, and they just turned hollow. So I will say that tree fern fiber alone in a small vessel dries out so fast. Whether it's amended with pon or perlite, it dries out super fast. But when you have tree fern fiber in a larger vessel or like a taller vessel, and you keep maybe like a reserve of water down at the bottom, which I will talk about later, it does last. The water does go a little bit further, but I'm just going to tell you right now that in smaller vessels, they dry out quick. So I watered these ones not too long ago, maybe 4 or 5 days ago, and they're both bone dry. So I'm just going to show you how I water really quickly, because that was also a question. I don't always use a squirt bottle like this. Sometimes I'll just use a jug or whatever, just depending on how big the vessel is. With a vessel like this, I'm basically just going to go over the top, across, and then I'm gonna go around the perimeter of the vessel. And the reason that I want to emphasize that you should go over the top like this is because even though it's in no drainage and even though the properties of your mediums are going to wick it upward, if you water it from one side, it doesn't necessarily mean that the water is going to be distributed evenly. And I just find that if you're right off the bat going in there and just, you know, making sure all of the water is being dispersed throughout the substrate, your watering is going to go a lot further, and I just think that your plants are going to be better for it. So yeah, that's how I would water. And you can see that I've got some water down at the bottom. It's about right here. And the reason that I feel okay about leaving some water in here is because, for one, this plant obviously is going to take in some of that water, so that's going to eliminate a little bit of it. And then also I have this one on my shelf here right under a 10-watt light, and it's controlled. It's getting 9 hours of light from that bar every single day. So I feel okay about having more water in there because I know it's going to evaporate, and I know that the plant is photosynthesizing and it's going to use that water. Same with this. This is, I think this is a philodendron Scott Morianum crossed with a 69686, or the other way around. This one is actually from Amanda. And it had crazy spider mites, which is why it looks kind of sad, but it is getting pretty big, which is exciting. So you can see this one is bone dry too, but I don't have product showcase on. It was probably so blurry, sorry. If I ever refer to product showcase in my videos, it allows the camera to do this. Like, it just focuses really quickly on the product that you're holding, product showcase. Anyway, so sorry about that. Like I said, this plant is very thirsty, but the root system loves tree fern fiber. And I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna just go across the top and then around the perimeter. And this one is actually sitting in my tent where it's super warm. There's a lot of light in there. So I actually feel okay about leaving an even higher reserve amount, but my rule of thumb is always a quarter of the substrate level, not the pot size. So that's something really important. I can't remember if I emphasized that in my first video, but like, let's say a vessel this big and your substrate goes to like right here. You don't want to do like a fourth of the whole vessel, because then your water would basically be like where your substrate is. I always say a fourth of how high your substrate level is, and I hope that makes sense. Anywho, yeah, so I do have both anthurium and philodendrons in tree fern fiber. To reiterate, I do like amending it. Also, something that I have been doing recently because of my dear friend Alice, she put me on to mixing tree fern fiber with soil, and I currently have a few plants in that mix right now that I can think of. My philodendron heterocraspidon, philodendron patriciae, anthurium beechii, and 2 of my anthurium pallidiflorums. All of them love it. So if you can amend your tree fern fiber, I recommend doing that just because of how expensive it is. And yeah, I just feel that like it's a much better mix. It's almost like amending soil with, you know, other mediums. I kind of treat it the same way. So I hope that answers all of your questions about tree fern fiber. Of course, if you have any questions regarding any of these things that I'm talking about today, please leave them in the comments. I'm gonna do my best to stay on top of the comments in this video. Sorry if I'm out of breath. I had some crazy deadlines this morning, and then I only had a few minutes to get ready because I need to race and finish this before my husband's next meeting. So like literally before I turned the camera on, I was just zipping around everywhere. Okay, question number 2 is takeout containers. Do you prefer to poke holes or keep it without drainage? Okay, so I have 3 examples here, but just to quickly preface this, I love using takeout containers. I don't care how ugly they are. They're super useful, especially if you're importing plants, rehabbing plants. They're just, I don't know, it's just so nice. I really don't know how people can not use takeout containers or just like reused recyclables. I don't know, I'm just imagining like trying to rehab something in like a terracotta pot or something. It just, I don't know, the thought of it kind of stresses me out. So I always keep takeout things like these guys. So there are 3 different kinds here. The first one is this one. So you can find this, oh my gosh, I think they sell these at, I want to say like reptile stores, because I think that they put things like bugs, like bigger bugs or like even reptiles in here, and then they have like the breathing holes. Yeah, these are really handy. I've actually never been able to find any of these locally. I got this from a local seller. So this is one way that you can add holes into your takeout containers. If you're wondering how to punch holes in them, all you need is an awl, and I'll show you a photo of what an awl looks like. You can get it at any craft store, Michael's, Joann's, Hobby Lobby. I'm pretty sure you can find it at like in like the sewing section or a craft section of Target or Walmart, Amazon, and you just poke holes like this, and it's super easy. So that's one way that you can use holes in takeout containers. Another way is doing this. So this came from Lauren at North Shore Tropicals. She basically just takes a scissor and she just cuts the edges here. You can also just take the awl again, just stick some holes at the bottom, or you can just use it as is with no holes. Sorry, I thought I saw fungus gnat in here. With no holes. I personally don't ever reach for these. My goal, kind of a weird goal, my goal is to try and get as many, if not all, of my plants in no drainage, just because I have, sorry. Okay, don't get distracted, Sherman. A butterfly. I don't ever tend to reach for these. The only reason I have them is because they've been given to me or I got a plant in them. Oh, I was saying, sorry, I found it. I'm trying to get most of my plants in no drainage just because personally with my schedule, with my watering habits being very, very bad and sparse because of my schedule, bad mental health weeks, it's just easier for me to care for my plants in no drainage because they hold water longer, and I have strategically placed plants around my home and have created things like my plant room, like my greenhouses, so that I can afford to have these plants in no drainage and have a little bit more water than a normal plant, not a normal plant, but a plant with drainage would get. That was just placed somewhere in the house where maybe it's not getting a ton of light or not a ton of warmth. So I will go more into that later in this video. But all that to say, I prefer my takeout containers with no drainage holes just because I prefer no drainage in general. But I'm trying to think of like when I tend to reach for pots with drainage. Because even like my imports are in no drainage. I prefer to have them in no drainage. I find that the roots grow more robustly and quicker with no drainage. I like that mycorrhizal inoculants don't get washed out in the watering process. I'm honestly trying to search for reasons why I would opt for a plant with drainage over no drainage, but I can't think of any. So yeah, that's my answer. For takeout containers, I much prefer it without drainage holes. Have you tested out TPS liquid soil for no drainage? Yes, let me show you what it looks like. So just a quick backstory on how I became a TPS whore. If you follow this channel, you have probably heard the name Amanda and Bunny thrown out a million bajillion times. Now let me just take a quick bunny break. So if you're not into hearing about my friend Amanda, go to the bathroom, go get a drink, go get a snack. I'm gonna talk about Amanda for a little bit. So I am doing a collaboration with Amanda soon, which is super exciting. I'm just, it's gonna take a little bit of time to put together. But I can't remember how Amanda came into my life. I do believe it was on Instagram, which is some miracle because I truly do not really ever check my Instagram DMs unless I've like asked for advice or something. I just get really overwhelmed with how many messages come in, and I don't know, it's just kind of socially exhausting. I do like reading them, but responding to them, all of them, is very exhausting. But I don't know, I think just it so happened that she messaged me, or maybe I messaged her, I can't remember, but we got to talking, we hit it off right away. I knew from the beginning she was my kind of people, and at this point I didn't even know that she sold plants. I just knew that she had really nice plants, and sort of over time she has taken me under her wing and has just shared a plethora of knowledge with me, both, I mean, all learned from other people that she knows and in her years of experience growing plants. And I like that she's in a lot of ways sort of unconventional with the way that she grows plants. You know, she goes against sort of like the plant community standard. She grows these huge, amazing anthuriums outside of normal or out of greenhouse conditions. She doesn't use humidifiers. She chops leaves off even though they're perfectly healthy. And I just sort of like really admired the way that she went about this hobby and how she was so low-key. Like she has so much to offer and to share, which is why I wanted to collaborate with her and kind of share that with you guys too. But she's so low-key, like she's not, you know, there's people in the plant community that grow like these really amazing plants, but you can tell by the way that they come off that they are sort of like, they act holier than thou, and they're just a little bit pretentious and stuff. But Amanda is the complete opposite. I know that she has like this mysterious sense about her. It's like this person on Instagram who has these amazing plants yet never posts on Instagram, only sells here and there, doesn't actually have a shop. So she's mysterious in that way, but she is like the coolest, like one of the coolest people I've ever met. And yeah, she has shared with me like her knowledge about growing different plants over the years, things that have worked for her, things that haven't worked for her. And I just really truly appreciate everything that she has taught me, because I feel like she's helped me sort of break out of like that fear of wanting to like sort of do things by the book. Yeah, she was the reason why I started growing all of my anthurium outside of greenhouses. She's the reason why I started using any TPS products. So I have a lot I feel like I owe a lot to her, and I just appreciate her so much. So all that to say, Amanda break is over. Amanda, if you're watching, you're probably cringing so hard right now, and I'm so sorry, but I love ya. So anyway, Amanda put me onto TPS. She uses TPS-1 fertilizer for her plants, and I was like, listen, if she told me at this point that she was using her pee to fertilize her plants, I would have done the same. I would have done it. Hey, we're using pee now. Yeah, she uses TPS, so I, of course, went down the rabbit hole of TPS products and didn't realize that they had so many different products. So right now I'm using TPS-1 fertilizer. I'm using TPS Billions mycorrhizal inoculant, which I love so much. And I'm also using TPS liquid soil. Oh, and then I'm also using 3 other fertilizers by TPS, which is like their houseplant line. Regular houseplant fertilizer, orchid, and then also for leafy greens. And the next thing that I want to try is their like silica stuff, liquid silica. I don't know, for my variegated plants, but I will talk about that once I actually start using it. So anyway, wow. TPS liquid soil. This is a biological remediator / soil conditioner. It is branded as a soil conditioner. But it says specifically here that you can use it for soilless media. So I'm going to just read this to you. Basically, in a nutshell, this cleans your soil and soilless media, which allows you to keep using the same substrate for a longer period of time. Now, it says that it's designed to turn your soil into the best possible growing medium for plants. Within minutes of contact, liquid soil will reduce salt loads and begin stabilizing imbalances. Within hours, bacterial colonies will form and fungus networks will establish. And within days, our proprietary plant extracts will fuel an enzymatic revolution, breaking down dead root material and kick-starting your soil. So I was immediately sold by this. I guess I can talk about that question I got about salt buildup. So the question was, now that you've been doing no drainage for a while now, do you have any issues with salt buildup? So that brings me to this. I will tell you that before this came into my life, I guess I don't quite know exactly what I'm looking for. A lot of my plants look like shit. I'm not gonna lie. A lot of them look like shit, but I have a pinpoint reason. Like I can pinpoint the reason why it looks like shit. And all of the times that my plants have declined or whatever, had yellowing leaves, dropping leaves, I never really correlated it to salt buildup. And the reason that I don't is because I really don't fertilize a lot, which might seem counterproductive to trying to grow really, really large plants. But I find that fertilizer, it's not necessary in large quantities in the houseplant hobby. And that's a very, very maybe unpopular opinion, but unless your plants are like freaking humongous specimens, yes, it's going to require more fertilizer, whether through the roots or as a foliar spray. You can use things like kelp extract. Oh my God, my sister. Sorry. We're planning my niece and nephew's joint birthday and she's blowing me up. So yeah, I didn't really ever observe anything that could have been too much fertilizing, just because I fertilize actually very little. And yeah, there is one plant though in particular that I have noticed mineral or salt buildup, and that is my Ripsalis paradoxa. This is not the only plant that this has ever happened to. This is just one that I have on hand to show you right now. So I'm gonna try and, oh, sorry, I got my little, I was prepping this video earlier. I'm gonna try to not spill, but hopefully you guys can see this. There is mineral / salt buildup on the very top of the substrate, and it's pretty apparent. I don't know if it's going to be obvious to you guys, but like all of this white residue like on here, that's like all mineral buildup. Now, this has happened before. Oh, you can even see some like on the sides here. This has happened before, actually on my Ripsalis paradoxa minor, and then I think it was also another trailing plant at the time. It could have been like a pothos that I had, but I've noticed that every time I've seen it happen, it was always with pon. I've actually never seen it with soil. It was always with pon, and it's always just at the surface of the medium, never really at the bottom. I mean, you can see this plant is clearly doing fine. It's completely healthy, which is why I've never worried about this, because this has been like this for a long time. This has been in this vessel for a very, very long time. I have used soil conditioner on this plant before. I didn't notice any difference. I'm not saying that this doesn't work. I'm just saying if mineral and salt buildup is an issue or is a thing with no drainage vessels, I have not firsthand observed any negative impacts of it. I'm not saying for sure that there are none. Of course, it's going to be a different experience for everyone, just depending on your conditions, what fertilizer you're using, how often you're fertilizing. I get so many questions about salt buildup and mineral buildup. It's just not an issue for me. I don't know what else to say. I think some people are going to watch this video and think I'm like trying to push an agenda or push no drainage and lie about it. Guys, if salt buildup and mineral buildup was an actual issue for me, I wouldn't do no drainage. Like, I don't know what else to tell you. There's no reason for me to like push something that doesn't work, yet let alone do it to my entire collection. And I also mentioned this in my part 2 no drainage video, that let's say for a vessel there is a lot of mineral and salt buildup. Like, by the time that would even happen, more than likely your plant will need to be repotted anyway. And that's because I'm not, and I'll talk about this later because it's another question, most of my plants are in relatively small no drainage vessels. I don't really have too many super large vessels. So for this plant, like, it's not super root bound yet, but you can see maybe in about, I don't know, I'd give this maybe until the end of summer where I'd consider sizing it up. And so whatever salt buildup is in here, I mean, I'm gonna be changing the vessel anyway. So that is just my uneducated opinion. It's just based on experience. For me, salt buildup / mineral buildup has not been an issue with the fertilizers that I've been using. But going back to the TPS liquid soil, I do use it, not super often. I've actually made this bottle last pretty long. I can feel, I think it is still like right here, and I shared half of this with Alice. So yeah, I'm using it on both my soil plants and my pond plants. So in the instructions, it says attempt a 10 to 15% water runoff during application for best results, and use warm water where possible. This, I don't know if they recommend that amount of water runoff, which is really not a lot because it is gonna like flush anything bad out. I personally have not allowed any water runoff, but if you want to try and do that, you can. You can literally just water as normal and then just pour some out. If I didn't gauge the watering level correctly, I'll just tip it over and pour the water out, and it's pretty simple. The next question is, do you have any plants in LECA? And if so, how do you flush the LECA in no drainage? I do have only one plant in LECA right now, and that is my Hoya clemensiorum, which I just saw today is finally pushing out a new leaf. I have been waiting so long for a new leaf on this one. She's finally here. I'm so happy. Anyway, yeah, this is really the only plant that I have in LECA right now, and it is starting to kind of start poking out. I mean, I knew this thing was starting to root. I just didn't know like how deep the roots were. But I'm not using LECA as a medium pretty much at all anymore. The only reason that I used LECA for this one is because it was all I had at the time. I was very low on pond. I was too lazy to rinse the pond that was dirty. So I used LECA. It's not that I don't like LECA. I actually enjoy it. I think it's a great medium. A lot of people have great success growing long-term in LECA, but I find that the fertilizing regimen for LECA versus pond is still quite different. And I don't know if you guys have really seen the fertilizer for people that use LECA. I think it's called like Flora Bloom or something. It's like a three-part fertilizing, regimen. So it's from General Hydroponics. So they have the 3-part thing. It's like Flora Micro, Flora Bloom, Flora Grow, and it's a whole thing. And that's how you can kind of keep like the balance of the nutrients at all time with LECA, especially if you're not using no drainage and you're just, you know, allowing it to run off. But I just don't have the brain capacity to do fertilizing like that. For me, it's just, I want it to be as simple as possible. I want to just add the fertilizer into my water, and then I want to water my plants. And that's how I just kind of go about this hobby. So I did grow with LECA before, even when I first started this channel, and I had good root growth, that's for sure. I found it to be a really great rooting medium and rehab substrate, but long term, my plants that were in LECA just weren't doing that great in terms of sizing up in terms of uptaking nutrients correctly. Like I feel like even though I was using CalMag, a lot of my leaves are still really deformed, and that was both in no drainage and with drainage. I don't know much about the fertilizing with LECA, but I can say that with my LECA plants in no drainage like this one, I'm just fertilizing it the way that I would fertilize my soil plants or my pond plants. Next question is kind of a short one. It's just any fertilizer issues. I think recently I over fertilized, and I'll show you who was a victim to that, who I think was a victim to that. This is my Anthurium Mag Crystal Lux, and what I think that this yellowing is from is either over fertilization or bad pH levels. I haven't checked my pH in a while, but I do vaguely remember fertilizing my plants a couple weeks ago, being a little bit heavier on the fertilizer because I had noticed a lot of my plants were growing. When you are fertilizing in no drainage, one of the drawbacks is that it's not just running off. You know, you can't just water it and let it flow through or whatever and have some nutrients stay in the medium. Whatever you're putting in here, it's in there. And yeah, I do think that I may have gone a little bit heavy on the fertilizer, and that's why you're seeing this yellow halo around the edges. I did recently repot it because I wanted to get it into clean soil. I let the root soak in a mixture of water and hydrogen peroxide for like an hour and got it into this thing. Honestly, I repotted this 2 days ago and it's already like taking root so fast. There's so many new roots on the side. I'm actually shook. Like I didn't think it was gonna happen that fast. But anyway, I'm not gonna say that I have had any fertilizer issues per se, but if you are doing no drainage, just make sure that you're watching your fertilizing habits, because everything you put in there is going to stay in there and some of the plants will not like it. This one's another quick one. What do you do if you put too much water? Like I mentioned before, I literally just pour it out. Sometimes it can get kind of difficult, especially if you've got like a really amended soil, or if you're using something like pond, like things just easily spill out. What you can do is just do like a towel. That's a really cool bird. Oh no, he's slipping. Oh buddy, you can't go on top of there. It's too slippery. Dude, this bird is not very smart. Anyway, I'm so distracted today. Okay. So what I've done before is you can, why do I always do that? You can do a paper towel. If you have like a damp paper towel, you can put it on the top, like lay it over the, I don't want to show you this yet. You can lay it over the top of the substrate and then pour it out. If you do moss on top of your substrate, it's a lot easier to pour things out because the moss kind of holds everything in. But I do it all the time. Like when I'm just like very quickly watering plants and I put way too much water into a vessel, I just pour it out. It's really easy. Where do I find vessels? This is like one of my most frequently asked questions. Thrift stores. I don't know what the thrifting is like in your area, but I get 99% of my vessels from thrift stores. They're so much cheaper. There are so many more options in terms of sizes. So definitely check a thrift store if you haven't. You can even go on Craigslist or Kijiji, whatever you use, Facebook Marketplace, and look for estate sales, because a lot of these homes will have vessels that you can use with no drainage. You can always check IKEA as well. They're just a little bit more expensive, not a ton of size options. Walmart, Target, they've also got vessels, but it's not, I don't know, I find that it's just not as good as thrifting. Next question is, do you ever test your pH, and does LECA mess up pH? I've heard that it does. I have tested my pH before. It was a really long time ago though. I haven't done it recently, and I should and I want to. And I'm thinking of making a video about it. So I'm not going to answer this question in depth because I'll save it for that video. But in terms of the second part of that question, does LECA mess up pH? I don't believe that the clay balls itself messes up pH. I really think it's the kinds of fertilizer that you're using with LECA that can disrupt the pH. But you know, I mix LECA into my soil, I mix it into my pond, and I don't notice any issues with using LECA as a substrate. I think this is the last question I'm going to answer before we go on a break, because I'm actually very hungry. I need to eat something. So what potting materials do you find work better than others for no drainage? Off the top of my head, the two substrates that I like the best with no drainage is definitely soil and pond. So I do have two plants to show you here. The first one is my Hoya Wyetii. You can see how healthy and happy these precious roots are. I feel like soil might seem kind of a daunting, it might seem like a daunting substrate or medium to use with no drainage because of how much water it can retain. But I think that a lot of it comes down to your conditions, and I really emphasize this in part 2 of my video. Your environmental conditions are really going to impact how that water is being used in your vessel. With soil that can hold a lot of water, that's, you know, even if it's like amended, it can still hold a good amount of water. But if you put it somewhere where you know that it's going to photosynthesize and it's going to be using that water, it's not, to me it's never been an issue. I have this one right in a south face or near a south facing window. It's got super dense mix. I do keep the window closed in my bedroom at all times, but my watering habit, that just went in my mouth. The watering habits that I have for a plant like this is going to be completely different for a plant that I have in a greenhouse. So for this, I probably will water this like once every other week because it's drying out a lot slower than my plants in warmer conditions, in brighter conditions, and in like controlled environments. It's really just understanding your environment and how much water you're putting in your substrate. And again, you can watch more of that in part 2. So yeah, the Wyetii is obviously doing really well where it's at in the bedroom. It doesn't mind that there's not as many amendments in here, and I would not really ever keep a reserve down at the bottom of this one just because I don't feel like this plant needs it for where it is. Maybe if it was in a greenhouse or like right in the window where it's like the water's gonna evaporate and dry out a lot faster, it's gonna photosynthesize more, it's gonna use that water, then maybe I would leave a little bit of water down at the bottom. But where it is now, I don't feel like that would be the best way to water this plant, even though it is very thirsty. So soil, I really love soil. Don't be scared to use soil. Just make sure that you understand your conditions first off, and really take the time to understand the amendments that you're putting in there. I feel like if you're new to the hobby, I'm losing my voice. If you're new to the hobby, you know, all the different things that go into soil, I could see why it would be a very daunting thing to try and understand. I'm gonna try and get through this video. But if you take the time to understand what perlite does, what worm castings do, what horticultural charcoal does, vermiculite, pumice, all of those things, if you take the time to understand what each of those things do, it's going to be easier for you to build your soil mix to your conditions. I remember when I put out my soil video, I got a good amount of people that were like, this mix sucks, this is terrible, it's not amended enough, it's way too dense, you know, you basically you should just be growing your plant in like cocoa husk or something. And to me, those comments are just so hilarious, because there's no way that you can confidently choose what the right substrate or amendment would be for someone else without knowing their conditions, without knowing their schedule, the temperature in their house. There's so many factors that go into it. So if someone ever comes at you with this just broad, like, oh, this is what aeroids grow in. Yeah, that's how they grow in the rainforest. Does this look like forest to you? No. Sorry, I get really riled up about it because it's these people that are so confident and they come on this channel and they're like, this is wrong because this is what I do. congrats. There's so much more to understanding soil than just saying aeroids prefer a chunky mix. I can tell you more of my plants have died in a super chunky aeroid mix than they have a mix that looks like this, period. So anywho, soil is probably my second favorite, no drainage medium. And then the first one is pond. Ever since using pond, it's had my heart. I just love Lechuza pond so much. My plants love Lechuza pond. You can see how much this plant has just taken to it. Like it's magical. And maybe I'll answer that one question before I go. So there was a question later that says, can you explain pond and its advantages and how to use it in no drainage? So how to use it in no drainage, you can refer to the video, part 2 of the no drainage video. I talk about how to pot with pond, but I'm going to read you a little blurb from the Lechuza pond website in terms of what its advantages are. So it says Lechuza pond has an ideal air to water ratio for plants, 45% water, 55% air. It also reduces a plant's vulnerability to diseases. Even after years, this structurally stable plant substrate does not condense and keeps its air permeable structure. Lechuza pond can be used for years without needing to be replaced. That in itself is one reason that I love using pond, because of the nature of being able to reuse it. I will say though that I wish Lechuza pond did not add slow release fertilizer to their pond, because depending on what kind of slow release it is, I have Osmocote. It's activated by heat or warmth. So there was a period of time when I first started to use Osmocote in my pond and in my soil, and I actually didn't even know that it was heat activated or warmth activated. So anytime that you boil your pond to sterilize it, you're waking up all those little and they're just like releasing an insane amount of fertilizer at the same time. So there was a point, I think Alice called it killer pond, because when we first started using Osmocote and we would boil our pond, or we would just put the plant in a very, very hot greenhouse, so many of the plants died, like just straight up died. The roots died, the entire stem died, and that is actually a symptom of over-fertilization. I feel like some people think over-fertilization only presents as like yellowing leaves or browning leaves or just like really bright chlorotic looking leaves, but over-fertilization can also look like root rot, stem rot, and just overall death. So that's one thing that I learned about Osmocote, or the kind of slow release fertilizer that I was using. So in that sense, I think that making your own pond, I know not everybody has the luxury of doing that, but if you can make your own pond, that is ideal, because then you can control the amount of slow release fertilizer in there, or you can just not put any slow release at all and just use regular fertilizer. But anyway, I do like the nature of how Lechuza pond can be reused and sterilized, and you're not being super wasteful with soil. Now I've limited myself to only 1 bag of soil per year, because I don't want to be excessively using peat moss. Peat moss is in regular soil bags, and it's, the harvesting of peat moss is terrible for the earth. So I don't know, it's not like a huge contribution, but it's my way of trying to limit my, carbon footprint in this hobby, because collectively we have a massive carbon footprint. Even if people don't want to believe that or accept it, it's true. So anyway, pond I just personally like because of how you can reuse it, and I've just noticed that my plants are just growing in ways that like I hadn't had luck with before in soil. Yeah, pond and soil are my 2 favorite substrates for no drainage. Whoa, I'm going to make some lunch and then we're gonna continue on with this, but you're gonna go on an ad break first, and I'll see you in a second. Welcome back everyone. So we left off at Question number 12. Well, I've answered more than that now because I've kind of skipped around. The question is, do you flush vessels or just completely change them? The only reason that I'm even bringing this up in this video is because it was asked so many times when I opened up questions, and I just wanted to reiterate that all of the questions regarding flushing is in this video here. I did a dedicated video on flushing algae or flushing salt buildup or whatever out of plants, just flushing no drainage vessels in general. I will say though, it's been a while since I've posted that video, and I no longer do that. Only because with the addition now of using mycorrhizal inoculants, I don't feel comfortable using the same hydrogen peroxide solution to flush it anymore. I knew that before, especially in soil plants, that there is already, you know, a certain amount of mycorrhizae in the soil. But now that I've understood it a little bit more now, and I'm actually using inoculants, I don't want to flush any of that out. So I'm not doing that anymore. But if that's something that you want to do and you're concerned about algae, even though it's not going to kill your plants if you don't like the look of it, yeah, watch that video. I'll also link it in the description. I also wanted to add that when flushing algae or whatever out of your vessels, depending on how much light the vessel is getting, it's gonna reach a point, if you're not using a cover pot, that it's gonna be too far gone in terms of being able to flush anything out of there. So I have an example. This is my Euphorbia globosa. This has been in the same vessel for, gosh, when did I get this? 2021? It's been in the same vessel for a very long time. And you can see how much algae is actually on this vessel. Flushing this is not gonna do anything. I can flush this all day long, all night long. It's not gonna look any different than it looks now. So to get this one clean, I'm gonna have to do a complete repot. So I just wanna mention that there's no way, truly, if you're using clear vessels, especially if it's exposed to light or the sun, you can't really avoid it. So sorry if you're expecting a better answer. I just had like 2 corn dogs and now I'm so sleepy. I had so much energy before lunch and now I'm so tired. Next question, when to use a more chunky and light mix over a dense mix? And I have 2 plants to show you. Before I bring these plants out, the way that I choose my substrate mixes and how heavily amended they're gonna be purely depends on the environmental conditions. Like I mentioned before, if it's somewhere in a controlled environment, or if it's somewhere that it's getting a lot of light, a lot of warmth, I feel more comfortable about using a dense mix, opposed to using a dense mix with a plant that is kind of just absorbing any light that it can from around it. Like the plants that I have in my living room, so this wall right here, on the other side of it are 2 shelves, and it's not getting a ton of light there. Honestly, at most, it's probably getting like 30 foot candles. I'm not kidding, and that's not very much at all if you don't know what foot candles are. For plants like those, I would never opt for a super dense mix. I definitely want something heavily amended where water can evaporate very quickly, because I know that the roots are not going to use all of that water fast enough if I watered it normally. Light and environment really determines what I'm gonna use. So I do also cover that in part 2, so give that a watch. And another factor that determines like what kind of substrate I'm gonna use in terms of how chunky or light it's gonna be is the root system. So if I'm confident in the root system that I have, I feel better about doing something that's a little bit more dense, because I know that those roots are actually functioning, they're working, they're gonna be moving nutrients out of the soil into the plant, it's gonna be moving water. Opposed to if you have a plant with like a subpar root system, it's not gonna be functioning the same way as a completely healthy plant, which is another great reason that you should use mycorrhizal inoculants, just because it really promotes healthy root growth and it creates this symbiosis with your substrate and your plant roots to ensure that your plant is like getting everything that it needs. It's like a barter system within there. It's pretty cool. Also, I have some examples to show you. So the first one is this Schefflera arbicola. I think that's what it's called, Schefflera arbicola. You can see this one is in a pretty heavily amended mix. There's a lot of coarse perlite in there. There's a decent amount of fir bark, and you can kind of, I hope you can see, but it's not packed really tightly. There are a good amount of air pockets even within the soil, and the roots are very healthy. I need to wake up. Wow, okay, I'm falling asleep here. So the reason that I've heavily amended the soil is because I knew from the beginning that this was going to be living out in my living space. I was never gonna put it in a greenhouse. I was never gonna put it in my plant room. It was either gonna sit like maybe in the kitchen or somewhere in my bedroom or even like the hallway. I always kind of knew it was gonna be somewhere that wasn't getting a ton of light. And that's why I have amended it heavily, so that I don't have too much water just sitting in that substrate for prolonged periods of time. I just want to give it enough really that the plant stays hydrated. I could afford to maybe put a little reserve down at the bottom for maybe when it's like we have warmer weeks like this week or in the summer. But generally for a plant that I know is not in controlled environments, that's not going to be right up next to a window or whatever, I'm going to amend the soil more than I would my greenhouse plants. Which brings us to the next plant. This is my philodendron summer glory, and the new leaf is looking so cute. I just cannot get over the emergent summer glory leaves. They are freaking everything. It's the venation, it's the gloriosum venation that gets me. It just truly is such a fantastic plant. I cannot recommend this hybrid enough. If you are able to get one, please do. It is so serotonin inducing. Anyway, when I acquired this one, I wasn't sure if I was gonna keep this in a greenhouse, because at the time that I got this, my philodendrons were still living on my shelf. But I knew that with the way that this is gonna grow, the likelihood of me being able to keep it on a shelf like this was probably very little, I mean doing it long term, right? So I was like, this can be a good plant that I can just shove in my plant room, on my plant shelf, or in like even my greenhouse or in my open exo. So all that to say, I knew that it was gonna live somewhere more controlled. And that's why I have done a more chunky mix. In comparison to this, you can really see how heavily amended one is over another. I would also recommend doing a denser mix if you are already familiar with that plant. So let's say that like hypothetically I had a Aphelandra squarosa, which is a zebra plant. My experience with it is that it's a very thirsty plant. No matter where it is, it loves water. So even though I wouldn't be putting that in a greenhouse, if I had it again now, I would opt to put it in a much denser mix, or I probably would just put it in like pond or something where I can leave a reserve down at the bottom. I would never put that one in a chunky mix, no matter where it was, even in a greenhouse. Just knowing the tendencies of that plant, I'm just gonna give it what I feel like it would want. So if you already kind of understand a plant and know its tendencies, you can, you know, alter your medium based on what you already know and not just go off the rule of thumb that I'm telling you now, which is like denser mix for controlled environments versus chunkier mixes in non-controlled environments. Pudge is back from his walk now. This plant is like getting really, really big. I can't believe how much it's grown since I've gotten it. When I first got this plant, I think this was the largest leaf on it. Whoa. This guy. So it's getting so big. So the next question is, sorry for any noise in the background, but I gotta keep going because Vince's meeting is in an hour. So what's the difference between your watering schedule with versus without drainage? with drainage versus without drainage. I will say that my plants with drainage definitely dry out faster than my plants with no drainage. I think that's kind of a no-brainer. No matter if it's in a greenhouse or not, my drainage hole plants always dry out honestly faster than I can keep up with, even if it is in a denser mix or if it's even in pond or something. So that's one reason why I've moved to no drainage, is because I just can't keep up with the watering, period. Especially in the summer, once things get really, really hot, there's no way that I could keep up with watering this many plants if they were all with drainage. So right now, you know, we are in the beginning of spring. I'm watering pretty much, I want to say once a week, like once every 7 days. Whereas my plants with drainage might need water every 4 to 5 days. And for me, that's just too much. I can't deal with it. I don't have very many plants anymore without drainage. Off the top of my head, the only significant one that I can think of is my gloriosum white veins. But once that one pushes out the new leaf, it's already growing up right against the pot. So I'm gonna be moving that to a pot without drainage just because it dries out so fast. I really like this next question. Isn't a LECA reservoir counterproductive if it wicks water back up to the soil if you're trying to use it for drain off / overflow? I really like this question. I don't know, it's nerdy, but I have gotten this question before, and the answer is no, it's not counterproductive. So I did talk about this in my other part 2 of no drainage. I talked about the elevated water table very briefly. So if you don't know what the elevated water table is, it's basically the zone between the unsaturated medium and the saturated medium underground. And this is referring to land on Earth, not specifically in a plant vessel, but you can still make that comparison. And I think I showed a good example of this. Actually, I did. Did I do a demonstration? I can't remember. It's been so long. But I do have some examples to demonstrate the elevated water table and why having a LECA reservoir down at the bottom is not counterproductive. And I want to reiterate again, even though I really tried to drive this point home in part 2, was the LECA reservoir in no drainage is not an alternative to drainage holes. It's not a drainage hack. It's not anything than what it is. It's a reserve down at the bottom where there is more air pockets. It's where you can have excess water flow. It's where your roots are going to grow into and be more water acclimatized, if that makes sense. Anyway, let me go get the plants. I'm going to show you the pond plant first. So this is my Solenocerius chrysocardium. I don't know if I'm remembering that correctly, the fern leaf cactus. And I've got in this vessel, oh no, I've got LECA down at the bottom and then pond up at the top. And I watered this maybe, when did I film my houseplant tour? 4 days ago. I filmed this 4 days ago, and there's still this reserve of water down here. You can see it. So for something like pond, the elevated water table is not as prominent as something like soil. So with pond, this substrate can only retain so much water. There's a max. It caps out somewhere, right? So once this substrate at the top has absorbed as much water as it can, the wicking is not going to do anything anymore. It's not like it's going to just like wick it all the way to the top and then just keep evaporating until it's all gone. You can actually see up here how dry the substrate is versus like right here in the center. So no, it's not counterproductive because the saturation levels of your medium is only a certain amount, and if you're exceeding that level with the water that you're putting in, then yes, you're going to have a reserve down at the bottom. And then for soil, it's more pronounced with the elevated water table. So the elevated water table would be right here. This is the elevated water table zone. So this is the underground where excess water runs off. and then this is the above ground where it's less saturated. In the earth, there are no drainage holes. I made a joke that there are drainage holes that like drain out into the earth's core, and that's why the earth doesn't overheat and explode. But no, there are no drainage holes in the earth. In the earth, what's below the elevated water table or the water table is like sediments and rocks. So it drains into there and it kind of finds its way or whatever. But there is going to still be that water table that's holding the most amount of saturation. And then it gets less and less as you get closer to the surface. So this one was watered 3 days ago? I can't remember. But you can see how much water is in here. And I do have some roots down at the bottom that are now creeping into the LECA zone. And the reason why I'm not worried about that being submerged in water is because these roots that form down here are essentially going to be acclimatized to these conditions. So the roots that grow down here are going to be a bit different than the roots that are growing up here in this area of the vessel. Yeah, that's why having a reserve is effective if you have really thirsty plants, or if you're gonna go away for vacation or something. You don't want to, like, let's say I was gonna go away for 2.5 weeks. That's usually how long I go away to California. I would probably fill this a bit higher than it's already at. And this is pretty high, but I would probably even push it to right here, just because these roots down here are more acclimatized, again, to being in water. So I find the reserve to be very, very helpful for things like that, or if you just don't have as much time to water. I'll talk a little bit about the transitioning in a bit. I do think that was a question. But to answer this question specifically, no, it's not counterproductive. It just depends on how much water you're adding. But what would be counterproductive is if I watered this plant much less when I did. So let's say I'm gonna water it, right? It all falls down to the bottom because it takes time for the water to wick it, or it takes time for the LECA to wick it back up and for your medium to wick things back up. But if I only did a little amount of water and then it wicked it up, it's counterproductive because now there's no water left down here. You basically only watered it enough to water the plant for what it needed. But yeah, if you're not adding enough water to not have a reserve, then having LECA down at the bottom is a bit counterintuitive. If you didn't want to have a reserve, then you could just fill this all with substrate and not have LECA down at the bottom. I don't think anyone realizes how I feel like I need to like start working out more to get my endurance up, because talking during these long videos, it's so physically exhausting. Like I cut out so many in-betweens. There's so many cuts between shots because I'm like huffing, like trying to catch my breath. Talking for like 4 hours straight, honestly, that I should add that to my resume. It's crazy. Next question is, soil with no drainage never works for me. How do you know when to water? My indicator for watering my soil plants is the color of the soil. Do I have any dry soil? I've been pretty good at my watering lately. I don't know what's gotten into me. It's kind of a bummer. I should have let something dry out before filming this video. Anyway, to me, an indicator is the color of the soil. I think you'll know that dry soil has a much lighter color than soil that is like fully drenched. Some plants can go longer periods between waterings where they're more drought tolerant. They'll hold on to water in those leaves longer without showing you any kinds of stress. Whereas some plants are a bit more finicky and they will just like wilt, sometimes beyond repair if you let that drought period extend a little bit longer than it would want. So besides just looking at the color of the soil, you obviously are going to want to look at your leaves to kind of tell a story. Feeling your leaves when it's really, really hydrated is really important. And I think this is one reason why it's good to kind of touch your plants all the time and really get to know them, because each leaf is going to feel very different depending on the hydration levels. So my Florida, I'll show you later, but my Florida green, it looks really happy, healthy, perky right now. But if I touch the leaf, I can pretty much tell you like how many days are gonna go by before it starts really showing me that it's thirsty. And just by looking at the soil right now, I can tell you that it's probably gonna need water in about a day or two. And also with a sunny day like this, it's gonna dry out even faster. The only thing I can say is get to know your plants, like really get to know them. Feel the leaves when they're super hydrated, feel them when they're really thirsty. Look at how low the petioles hang when they're hydrated versus dehydrated. And your leaves will pretty much tell you everything that you need to know, as long as you're taking the time to understand it. But for me, my number one indicator is always the color of the soil. This is also a good question. When do you know when to use LECA down at the bottom versus not using it? Off the top of my head, I'll tell you that pretty much in any super tall vessel, like a vessel this tall, I'm gonna use LECA down at the bottom. I mean, not only just because of wanting a reserve, but this is a lot of substrate. Like, let's say that I was gonna do all pond for this. That's a lot of pond to put in this one vessel. Whereas LECA, you know, it has such a large surface area depending on how large the clay balls that you're using is, but it takes up a good amount of the pot that you don't need to use your other substrates. Or like if I was using this with just straight tree fern fiber, this is, if you filled this all with tree fern fiber, that's like $5. That's too many dollars. So I do use LECA really more so as a way to fill really tall or really big vessels where I don't want to use a lot of my medium. Another reason that I would use LECA down at the bottom is depending on how large the vessel is and what plant it is. If I know that a certain plant has more water requirements and just historically has been a more thirsty plant for me, then I feel better about doing a reserve down here because I know that the plant will use it. I would never use like a LECA reserve down at the bottom for a plant that like wasn't a heavy drinker. I would just use whatever whatever medium I was going to use anyway without the LECA. Again, tall vessels or just really big vessels is when I want to use LECA, and then also for super thirsty plants. Next question is, do you worry about airflow in no drainage? This reminds me of, I wonder if I kept that thing I drew. I wonder if I have it on my in my highlights. I don't laugh at myself very often, but this time I was like, this is funny. Damn it. Good for nothing Sherm. Someone had left this long drawn out comment about why all my plants are eventually going to die at some point without drainage, and I went on Instagram and I drew a little diagram of how your plants breathe with drainage holes, and I drew like these little lips sticking out of the bottom of the drainage hole, and you had to be there. Now it's not funny just explaining it. Now I feel embarrassed, and I find it really fascinating how a good amount of people will continue spreading this narrative that these tiny little drainage holes down at the bottom, or a single drainage hole, is gonna be the one thing that contributes greatly to airflow in your vessel. The reason why we use such amended mediums in this hobby is, one, many of them are epiphytes or hemi-epiphytes, where they'll grow either directly on sides of trees or they'll start in the ground and then grow up trees. This is a really great example is Tyler. I mention him all the time because he's just a like fantastic plant grower. It's actually unreal how large he can grow his plants, but he had recently posted his Patriciae about how this massive specimen that's like 3 times my size is growing in a 6-inch pot. 6 inches. And that's because of the moss pole. Those roots that are climbing the pole, that's how it's getting a lot of its nutrients. And I do know that he heavily advocates for foliar feeding with kelp extract, so that's something that I need to get back doing, although I don't know if I want my plants to get as big as that because I want them to fit in my apartment. But all that to say, there's so much more to the health of your plant than that 1 or 2 or 3 drainage holes down at the bottom of your pot. No, I don't worry about airflow in my vessels because I know that the amendments that I'm adding are you know, it creates these little air pockets in the soil. And I did talk about this in part 2. I showed you air pockets in perlite and blah blah blah. And yeah, to me it's a non-issue. I can show you so many healthy roots around the apartment that have not a single drainage hole, and I have actually killed way more plants and way more roots with drainage holes than without, because drying out a plant is just as detrimental to a plant than adding too much water. So that's all I gotta say about that. Do you fully change the reservoir or do you add new nutrient water to what's there? I think this is more so a question for maybe people who grow hydroponically with LECA, because they're, you know, it's kept in like a big reserve and then they add all the fertilizers in the water itself. But for me, no matter what substrate my plants are in, I pretty much treat them all the same. So in terms of like nutrient water, I don't really see like the reserve down at the bottom of these vessels as like, I don't really see it as a reserve just for nutrients. I just fertilize all my plants the same way. And just to remind you right now, I'm fertilizing at 1/4 strength, if not even less than that, every week or every watering. They're gonna get some kind of fertilizer. I do skip fertilizing more so in the winter, where I'll just only do water in my sprayer and not do any fertilizer. But for any plants that are actively growing, they do get fertilizer, just very diluted amounts. My plant room is a place where all my plants get fertilized basically year round. Very rarely, or sometimes I'll just make small batches of fertilizer water, but I really only do that when I'm like filming or when I'm noticing that a plant is pushing out like a ton of growth where I feel like the amount of fertilizer in my sprayer is not going to be enough. So to answer your question, I don't ever change out reservoirs. I just fertilize normally and I let that water kind of go into the plant or evaporate, and then I do the same thing over again. And I don't know if that really answers the question, but I hope it does. How do you deal with water roots down in no drainage when transitioning it to a bigger vessel? This is actually a good question. Early on in this hobby with specifically these imported aeroids, I did find it a little bit trickier repotting plants with no drainage because of how accustomed or acclimatized these roots down here, especially like imagine this being completely root bound down at the bottom and it was time for a repot. Because of how used to these roots are being just submerged in water, when you're transitioning it to a bigger vessel and you have those roots now sitting in soil instead of water or in a reserve, because now you're potting it in a larger vessel, right? The one thing that I've found that helps a lot is being a little bit heavier with your watering if you can in the first few weeks. But this also means that you should put it somewhere where it's getting more light. So I wouldn't recommend doing this method if it's a plant that's sitting in like a dark corner or something, because then you can run the risk of root rot And also keep in mind that these roots that are sitting in water are a little bit more delicate than like your average soil roots or roots that would like go into like a pole or something. They're super, super delicate. Like if you've ever seen any water roots, they've got these like little fuzzies around them, and they're just like, yeah, they can just like snap off easily, or they dry out really fast. If you have ever taken a water rooted plant out of water just to like do something and like 10-15 minutes go by, like some of those roots will like completely mush and just completely dry up. So they are more delicate. They are used to being in water all the time. So when you're transitioning to a larger vessel, I would recommend watering heavier or watering deeper in the first few weeks, but making sure that you're giving it adequate light or an increased amount of light or at least warmth while it's transitioning. And then once you start seeing new root growth, then I would just go back to what your normal regimen would be. How do you know when it's time to repot? It's really not any different than your plants with drainage. You know, when you can see that it's root bound, then size it up. Or if you're noticing a lot of like mineral buildup at the top, you can repot it. If your vessel is completely overtaken with algae to the point where you can't even see the water lines anymore, I would repot. I think one of the first rules that I ever heard in the plant community, why do I still have this on here? One of the first rules like that I first learned, like doing a Google search when, you know, I started off in this hobby like 10 years ago or something. I think it's been more than that now, 13 years. When I say that I was in this hobby 13 years ago, I wasn't growing plants like this. I was growing just your normal house plants. But one of the first things that like came up in Google, like houseplant care, is of course the bright indirect light, and then to let it get super root bound before repotting. That to me, the bright indirect light thing is such bullcrap advice, but for me, waiting for a plant to get really root bound is kind of it's still a rule of thumb that I follow, because every time that you repot a plant, you're introducing it to a level of risk of, you know, dying or snapping roots off or just messing with the little ecosystem that it has going on in there. So for me, I only repot if I really, really, really have to. And sometimes when your plants are root bound, it actually promotes more growth or more vigorous growth. But you know, it also works the other way, where when your roots have more areas to grow, it will promote growth that way too. But I guess all that to say, for me, I will not repot unless I absolutely have to. This new leaf was still sort of hardening off during my houseplant tour, I think. But I think this is my favorite leaf that I've ever grown on this plant. This color is, it's my life. This is what I live for now, this leaf. I love it. And I was a little worried. I'm like, okay, there's not a ton of like dark, you know, variegation. And then this leaf, I literally only noticed today because I pulled this plant out for this video. Where did this guy come from? This one only hardened off like 3 days ago. I didn't even know that there was an entirely new leaf amongst us, but it's got a good amount of variegation. Again, it's this like dark green on green variegation. I am obsessed with it. Like, I no longer even want this like white color anymore. I just love this greenish, yellowish color. Anyway, looking down at this Frydek, this is a plant that's been on my radar for a while to repot for multiple reasons. So we have like some pretty gnarly, disgusting things going on down here. Not disgusting in a way where it's like affecting the plant, but for me looking at it, I don't like it. That's a lot of algae, it's a lot of gunk and residue from fertilizers and whatever that's in there that I want to get off. All of that, that's so gross. Another reason is because I think that there are 3 corms in here that have been working so hard to get out of here. Or maybe it was just 2. So you can see one corm right here that is stuck. So that's another reason that I want to repot this plant, is to save this little corm. Another reason I would repot is if the roots were growing upward. I'm not 100% sure what the reason for that is. Some people have said that it's growing upward because there's no drainage holes, and I'm sorry, I just don't buy it. Sometimes when your roots have nowhere else to go, they just grow upward. So once roots start poking up the top, that's kind of my cue to like get it into something larger. So I don't necessarily feel like I need to get this into something much bigger than this, honestly, because alocasia roots are really, really delicate. And once you remove a lot of this pon, the roots, it's gonna like shrink down. Like I could probably repot it into this same vessel, but just kind of like shift around the roots a little bit, harvest the corms. I can even chop a little bit of the stem off to clear up some space. Another reason that I would repot is because too much stem is exposed. So you can see not a lot of stem is exposed on this plant, but you know, you will have more robust growth the more you cover your stem with substrate, because it can push some roots out. Let's put this guy here in the meantime, because he's so pretty, or she's so pretty. So here's a good example of a plant that needs to be repotted. There's too much stem exposed. My options are to leave it in this vessel, which I honestly could if I add a pole. But I don't know, I've been so hesitant to get this on a pole, but now that I can see like a decent amount of stem, I feel like now would be probably like the most ideal time to get it on a pole, or even just a plank, something to support it. So that's one reason why I would repot and get this into something taller, is if too much stem is exposed and I wasn't willing to put a pole on it. Another reason, and this is more so the case with imports, when you have old and new roots that are living or like coexisting, it's not that they can't coexist. I have plants in my collection right now where there are like old rotted or just like dead roots, but a lot of really, really good roots, and it's still like quite healthy in there. I'm not gonna go and rescue my plants unless the leaves and the growth is telling me otherwise. My kind of rule that I give myself is like, don't help a plant unless it absolutely needs it. So you can see in this vessel that there's a good amount of new roots in here, but there's also dead roots. If you didn't see what the substrate looked like, you would, like honestly, you would never guess that this plant had dead roots in the vessel. And I've been telling people that like sometimes as hobbyists we think that we're doing the plant a favor when really we're just kind of disturbing its natural thing that it's got going on, like it's going to sort itself out, and we sort of disrupt that process. So just leave it. But because I don't already have a pole in here, and it would be too hard to like stick a pole in here as it is with as many roots as this has, I would probably just do a complete repot and then do a pole as well. So those are kind of things that I use, or that's kind of like the thought process that I have when I am thinking about when to repot a plant. But again, it's not really any different than normal plants with drainage holes. How do you apply systemic in no drainage? The same as you would a plant with drainage. I'm assuming we're talking about a soil drench or a substrate drench. The only thing I will say is that I use it in half of the dosing that is recommended on whatever systemic you're using. So whatever's on the directions, I basically just do half of that because there is going to be no runoff. And I don't want to fuck around and find out what happens when you have, like, if there is a such thing as too much systemic in the substrate, if you aren't allowing anything to run off. So I don't have a ton of experience or knowledge in this area, but this is just what I do. I just don't use things at like full strength, really anything, fertilizer, soil enhancer, systemics, whatever. I just don't use it at its full recommended strength in no drainage vessels. Succulents in no drainage long term. I can't remember where I talked about this, but I think I mentioned it a couple times, how Oh, that's so itchy. I initially started using no drainage 10 years ago when I created these little succulent terrariums with my ex-boyfriend. We would find little vessels at thrift stores and antique markets and stuff, and we would take the succulents from his mom's garden. We'd build out these little succulent gardens, and we would sell them in our shop that we had at the time. And this is really when I started learning about how to water and fertilize properly with plants in no drainage, because I had always, up until that point, assumed that all plants needed drainage. I actually had a client who had a really, really big sort of, I can't explain it. I don't know, it's kind of a weird thing to say, but like if you go to like an Asian market or a Filipino market, they sell those like glazed pots and stuff. Most of them have drainage holes, but some don't. And I had a client who did not have drainage holes in her big pot that she had in her front yard. She used rocks just down at the bottom. And I know that this is heavily frowned upon in the community. It's not something that I would do myself. But I will say that a lot of the older generations that came before us that have been growing plants have used rocks as drainage and have made it work. Anyway, she had a bunch of rocks down at the bottom, and she had this huge succulent garden, and it was like trailing over, and she had all these sedums, and it was so beautiful. And that thing was probably 15 years old. And it's never had any drainage. So, and it was living outdoors. I do think though that when it was raining, she would pull it under her covered front porch, because you don't want it just filling up with water, right? But to answer the question, long story short, yes, you can grow succulents in no drainage long term. I would recommend still using a succulent mix or like a grittier, sandier cactus mix or something, and not use just like straight up soil. I have used aeroid soil for my succulents and cacti before, but I've just found that they've done so much better in a real succulent cacti mix. How to do no drainage for longer holidays or vacations. Talked about this briefly in this video. Just water normally and hope for the best, or what you can do is give it more water than you normally would. Leave higher reserves down at the bottom for all of your no drainage vessels, but increase your grow lights. If you're using grow lights, I would increase the length that you leave them on at least by like 2 to 3 hours while you're away, or put things closer to windows. Not right up against a window, especially if it's a really warm window, like a south-facing window, but just put it closer than you normally would. So you can see, so all the plants behind me, when I go on really, really long vacations where I know that nobody is gonna come, especially if it's in the winter, I will literally take every plant off. I'll put them on my dining table, and I'll put my dining table up against my window here, just so that they're getting more light, because if they have more water in the vessel, I want it to be evaporating faster than normal. So that's all I can say. Another suggestion that I have for you is, if you know that you have a vacation coming up, you can run some experiments a month or a month and a half before you have to go. You can leave the water level higher than you normally would, like how high you would do it during vacation, and observe it and see how it does. See if you need to move it closer to a window, see if you need to leave grow lights on longer, see if maybe that's too much water for as long as you're gonna be gone, and do some like trial and error things before you actually go. Do you think alocasia corms develop faster or slower in no drainage? I can't really say anything about this because I've actually never tried to root or grow an alocasia corm in anything but no drainage. I can say that I've had really good success growing in no drainage, or like growing corms in no drainage. They grow, or they root pretty quickly. They push out growth pretty quickly, depends if you give it like a cloche or like high humidity. But yeah, I've never unfortunately grown a corm with drainage holes. Next question, I just talked about this. Can you use rocks instead of LECA? think I addressed this in my plant community tips and tricks, like whether I agree or disagree. I personally would not use rocks down at the bottom of a vessel purely because of how heavy it is. And then also just like the composition of a rock is not the same as like a clay, like LECA or something, where it's just like naturally gonna wick things up. Your water really is just gonna kind of sit there. So for me, using rocks as not drainage, but using it as a reservoir level is a no for me. But I know that it's been done for years and years and years. I've met hobbyists that have been doing this way longer than me, that have been growing large trees with no drainage holes and just having rocks down at the bottom. There was a hobbyist that I met when I first moved to Canada in 2017. He actually uses terracotta pots at the bottom of his no drainage vessels, or his really big pots. He basically just, like any terracotta pots that have broken or cracked or is just like no longer good to use anymore, he just takes a hammer, he smashes them into a couple pieces, and he just lays them at the bottom of the pot so that it, you know, it can drain into the bottom of it. The terracotta actually like holds a little bit of the moisture, but he uses that instead of rocks, and it's lighter. It's a little bit lighter than using rocks. It's still kind of heavy, but yeah, he would put these broken terracotta pieces down at the bottom, and he'd even mix these like smaller terracotta pieces into the substrate itself. It's like the most odd thing that I've ever seen. I did buy a plant from him, and when I was repotting it, it was just so funny, like seeing all these like terracotta pot pieces like falling everywhere. But it was like the healthiest plant ever. It was beautiful. All of his plants were beautiful. So obvious, and you know, he's much older than me. I think at the time when I met him, he was like maybe in his like mid 60s or something, and he said that he had been growing since like the 90s. So yeah, I trust his, you know, his methods, and it's obviously working for him. But you know, if someone said like, would you use rocks as a layer down at the bottom of a no drainage vessel, I'm straight up gonna say no, it's not for me. Have you come across any plants that don't like no drainage? No, actually none that I can think of. Like even plants that I thought would not do good in no drainage have like done so amazing in no drainage. I truly cannot think of one plant that I wouldn't put in no drainage. Yeah, no. The answer is no. Long-term health of the plant as they get huge in no drainage. Are there any repotting issues if they're too big and you need to change medium? So I have two plants to show you. Oh my gosh, I hope I can get through this. I have to finish this in 30 minutes. Okay. So here is a photo of my big monstera. This one is growing in no drainage right now. I had it growing since I got it. I had it growing in a pot with drainage, but it had one of those, I guess it's considered self-watering. But anyway, it was in a pot that had like a drip tray connected to it, but like the water would just like go back into it or evaporate or whatever. And it did completely fine. Now it's in like my largest glass vessel that I have, and it rooted pretty quickly in there, or I got new roots on there pretty quickly. Didn't have any leaf loss, hasn't shown me that it's unhappy. It still looks really perky and just as good as it was when it was in its other pot. In terms of like long-term health, I really can't say, because I mean, all the plants that I've had here in this apartment, the earliest that I would have had it is in 2017, because that's when I moved to Canada. So I'm not quite sure how long-term you're talking about, but in my experience that I've had, I really don't have any issues with plants being able to live long-term, or large plants being able to live long-term in a no drainage vessel. Another one that I'm going to show you, and I'm going to try and bring it over here. I need to move the camera back though. I don't know why I attempted this. I really don't. I could have just shown you a photo. But here she is. I knew she was gonna fall. Okay, I have to move you back more. Okay, so here is my big Florida green. She is really, really getting large. There's actually 2 plants in this one pot. I added a smaller Florida green to it so that it could like be a bit more bushy and not so sparse. I want to show you the vessel that it's in though. It's in a pretty large vessel, I'd say, or it's at least really tall. I have LECA down at the bottom and then soil up at the top. This one was a more recent repot, but I'm actually surprised at how quickly it took root into here. So, I mean, you can see how large this plant is. You can see how big this vessel is. It's like as big as my torso. And then you saw like how big the vessel is for my monstera. Sorry, I'm gonna put this back because it's a lot. So yeah, you saw how big the Florida green is, not really having any issues with roots or the health of the plant. It's seemingly happy. So I can't really say that there's any correlation between the long-term health of a plant in no drainage versus with drainage. Of course though, if you're planning to keep a plant in the same vessel for years and years and years and years, like a really, really large plant, you'll likely want to use some kind of soil conditioner, and also just making sure that you're not fertilizing super heavily, because then the chances of you having something like mineral buildup or salt buildup is going to be higher. And then the next question was, what's the biggest you do in no drainage, and where do you find your large vessels? So my monstera might actually be my max size with a no drainage vessel, and that's only because it's kind of hard to find anything larger than that, unless you're using a pot with drainage and then like covering up the drainage holes yourself, which is not something I've ever done, or something that I wouldn't even know where to start with that. But really the only reason I've capped out at a certain size for planting in no drainage is because I can't find any vessel larger than the one that I've shown you with the monstera. Now, if I had the option to do it in no drainage and could find a vessel large enough, like for like my Euphorbia trigona, which I'll show you a photo of here, if I could do no drainage for this plant, I probably would. You know, for me, it's not an issue, but at the same time, like once you have a plant as large as the trigona, I feel like you end up having to put it in a pot with drainage anyway, just because that's what's readily available. Like I wouldn't even know what vessel to put this trigona in, this Euphorbia in, unless it was like a bucket, like a really big bucket. How do you deal with the transition period from soil with drainage to soil with no drainage? I'm actually glad that I have something to show you today, because I just recently did this. I moved my tortum from no drainage into a pot with, I moved my tortum from a pot with drainage to a pot without drainage very, very recently, and I'm so glad I did, because this plant dried out so damn fast. So there's really not much happening in the substrate because it was a very new repot, but you can sort of see some things happening here and there. Nothing too wild and insane right now. I will say that for this specific repot, she did lose 2 of the lower leaves, which were like this small. And the only reason that I know it has something to do directly with the repotting process is because this plant doesn't shed. This plant is just like my Florida Beauty, where it just likes to hold on to its leaves, and as new leaves grow, it doesn't really shed the older leaves like many aeroids do. So I know that it had something to do with the repot, because to lose 2 leaves at the same time is just not normal for this plant. I can touch these leaves all day long. To answer the question, if you're gonna go soil specifically from drainage to no drainage, I will say to water less than you normally would. Because your plants with no drainage, oh my god, Sherman. Because your plants with drainage are going to dry out a lot faster than something with no drainage, you don't want to like overload that vessel with too much water right away. You do want the substrate to be a little bit more on the drier side, kind of like it would in its old vessel. So for this one, I pretty much let this get bone dry, not bone dry, I let it get pretty dry before I added more water, and I watered this one about a day ago. I think it was actually yesterday that I watered this because I treated it with Azamax. It's still sort of in its transitionary period, so I'm gonna wait until this goes dry. This is really, really dark. I'm gonna wait till it gets much lighter in color, and then that's when I'm gonna add water again. And I'm gonna do that probably for maybe another month or month and a half until I can see some new roots forming. That's kind of how you know that a plant has sort of accepted its new pants, is when you see new roots forming. That's kind of like my go ahead to get things back to how I normally would treat the plants during a transition period. Once I can see some new roots, then I'm like, okay, it's gonna be fine. How often do I water? I watered an anthurium because it stayed wet too long, or maybe because of air pockets. That is something that I cover in part 2, but just to quickly touch on it, the reason that your anthurium rotted could be for multiple reasons. Like you said, stayed wet too long, maybe there wasn't enough air pockets in your substrate. It could have been a combination of both. Depending on which anthurium you're talking about, some like to be more on the dry side versus some that don't mind having wet feet all the time. It's kind of hard to say when to water when I don't know exactly what you're dealing with specifically, which plant you're dealing with, where you have this plant, etc. But just based on how you worded this question, where you said it stayed wet too long, my guess is that wherever this anthurium is not getting enough light for how much water you added. So if you want to keep, if the anthurium was doing fine with drainage holes where it was growing well, then it's not the light. You'll just want to pull back a little bit on watering in that same spot, because obviously the light or the temperature isn't warm enough to use all that water fast enough, or to evaporate that water fast enough. So don't be scared to just water a little bit. Oh my god, these freaking gnats. Don't be scared to like pull back your watering, or not watering as much as you normally would with drainage holes, because again, you're not allowing it to like flow out. It's all staying in that vessel. But yeah, watch part 2 of the no drainage video if you haven't already. How do you deal with pests in your mediums? Is it the same? Yes. If you are having issues with pests in the soil, you treat it just the same as you would a plant with drainage. Next question is, do you only ever use clear vessels for no drainage? If not, how do you monitor water levels and root growth? 99% of my plants in no drainage are clear, and that's just because I like the ease of being able to see exactly what it needs. But I do have the random plant here and there, like my Lepismium cruciform in my bedroom, to this Euphorbia balsamifera that you can see no drainage holes down at the bottom and is not in a clear vessel. I noticed that when I let it dry out, all of the green turns to brown, and it stays bald for a couple days before it starts regrowing new leaves. And you can actually see where the old leaves were. If I just shake this a little bit, all of the dead leaves will fall, and it grows really fast. The new leaves grow in super, super fast. This one was bald like last week. There was like not a single leaf on it. I watered it and she came right back. So for a plant like this specifically, where I understand what the plant looks like when it's happy and hydrated, like this, nice and lush, really green, I know that it has moisture in the substrate. But the reason I knew that this was thirsty last week was because there were no leaves. I was like, oh, well, there's no water in there because there are no leaves. But if you don't really know what your plant looks like when it's hydrated versus not hydrated, you can do the chopstick method. You just wiggle a chopstick into the substrate. You pull it out. If it's dry, then your substrate is dry. And you can do 2 holes just to be sure. You don't have to stick it all the way to the bottom. Super dry. So, and you can see just kind of like how easily it comes off. I'm gonna give this some water. And this one dries out really fast because it's in a super gritty mix, like a gritty cactus soil mix. So if I let this plant go two more days without water, because you saw that it was pretty much dry, then all of these leaves would have been gone in 2 days. But now that I've watered it again, it's gonna hold on to it much longer. So let's say that you didn't see me just water this plant right now, and I wanted to know what my water levels were like. If you stick a chopstick in the plant and it comes out looking like this, then you know it's fine. It's got some water in there and you probably don't need to water it. So that's how I monitor plants that I can't see right through. You can just stick a finger in there, stick a pinky in there. I usually just use a chopstick. It's way easier, doesn't get in your nails, but that's how I monitor water levels with these kinds of pots. Which substrate dries out faster versus slower? Which do you prefer? I'll say that of all of these substrates that I'm using in no drainage, tree fern fiber and perlite definitely dries out the fastest. And then the slowest is soil. And I already kind of told you that I prefer using soil and pond for my no drainage vessels. Which plants have done really well for you in no drainage? I'm not going to take them out right now, but I did list 5 plants. So my alocasia friedek, you would have seen earlier, has always been in no drainage, loves it. She's a beauty. My Florida Beauty is another one that I've always really had in no drainage and has just done so well. My Hoya Nicholsonia New Guinea Ghost, any monstera, really, because I've been growing monsteras the longest out of any plant, really. I got my first monstera in 2009, 2010, I can't remember. I remember I had it in my apartment when I was living in San Francisco, which was 2009, and I actually grew it it was a small one. I grew it in a ball, you know those ball mason jars? Anyway. So any monstera really has done well for me, no drainage. And then my alocasia scalprum is another one that I can think of off the top of my head. And then the last question, oh, thank God, we made it. And his meeting is literally in 5 minutes, so I need to go. But can you elaborate on the parfait method / choosing between layers and substrates? If you have no clue what I'm talking about, the parfait method is just a fun little name I coined when I was trying to rehab the most finicky, stubborn monstera you've ever met. So on this one cutting, I had a healthy root system. I had a stem that kept rotting. The stem was about this thick and it just kept kind of getting mushy on the sides. And then I had a part of the stem that had really good potential for growing aerial roots out of, that I could get some nice roots to form just in case anything happened to the lower part of that plant. In my mind, I was like, okay, I've got healthy roots. I'm gonna do LECA down at the bottom and I'm gonna grow these nice roots. I'm gonna keep them going. This stem though is very dicey and I want something that has a lot of porousness to it, a lot of airflow, something that's really light and not as heavy as LECA. So I opted for a coarse perlite. And then at the top, with the stem that was healthy, that looked like it had the starts of aerial roots that I wanted to kind of promote growth on, I just opted for moss. And so what I ended up with was this thing that looked kind of like a parfait, LECA perlite moss up at the top. And that's kind of how the parfait method came along. And it's a method that I still use when I am dealing with the troublemakers. I do not do this on every plant that I'm rehabbing. I don't do this on every plant that I'm importing or whatever, trying to root. I think that's where some people got confused. They thought that the parfait method was a method that I used all the time, and it's not. I don't necessarily feel the need to do like a full parfait unless I'm dealing with a plant like that monstera, where I need the certain properties of each medium to work to my advantage some way or somehow. And that's why I said to like try and, if you're new to this hobby, try to just understand what each of the amendments do, because you can tailor it to certain situations like this in your favor if you are dealing with like a really finicky plant. I actually don't have any plants in like a proper parfait method right now because I'm not really rehabbing anything to that extent, but I want to elaborate more on the parfait method because I don't think that I've actually done a dedicated video on it. I do get a good amount of questions on it, like how do you choose which substrates over what, or like how do you know what the right substrate is to use based on the plant that you're trying to rehab. So I have decided to just do an entire parfait method video on its own. I am going to take questions on my Instagram. By the way, if you're wondering like how you can get these questions submitted for videos like this, follow me on Instagram because that's where I take in most of the questions, or that's where I always take in the questions. And what else? Oh yeah, so with that said, I am gonna open my questions again on Instagram maybe next week to parfait questions, and I'll do an entire video on it. But that is going to conclude today's Q&A for No Drainage. I hope that what I said was helpful. The last few hours have been a blur for sure. Fingers crossed any outstanding questions that you had regarding no drainage that I didn't cover in part 1 or part 2 was covered in this video. But like I mentioned in the beginning, if there's anything that you want me to elaborate on, or if there's something that I didn't touch on in this video, please feel free to leave it in the comments, and I promise on this video specifically, I'm gonna try and stay on top of the questions. I hope that if you are watching this video because you've been thinking about potting in no drainage and needed some encouragement or just needed advice, I commend you for doing your research. And of course, everything that I say in this video or on this channel in general is just based on my experience with plants. I am not a professional. Everything that I say on this channel can be challenged. You should do your own research, blah, 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 the whole thing. But if you need a little push and some words of encouragement, if you are gonna try no drainage, just do it. I promise, once you get the hang of it, you might have some losses here and there. It's not to say that I haven't like had my fair share of losses to get to the point I am now, but give it a try. Even go to your local Home Depot, pick up an easy plant and try it with that first. There's no reason that you should be experimenting with no drainage with any of your really expensive prized plants. Treat it like any other experiment. Give it a go on a cheap plant, try it with a pothos or something, and see the results for yourself, understand your conditions for yourself. I think that growing in no drainage really teaches you a lot more about plants than you'll even ever expect. So with that said, thank you guys for watching. Please don't forget to give it a thumbs up if you liked it, because it helps us a lot on YouTube. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for watching another video, and I will see you in the next one.